At the end of part 1, we looked at the example of being conscious of your elbow. Your elbow in this example is the metaphyer, i.e. the thing we are trying to describe. But what is the metaphrand in this case? The metaphrand is the learned concept of elbow which you have in your head. This can be demonstrated when we think of how language helps us categorize things quickly. When you look at this picture, you automatically know it is a tree, and this is partly because language allows us to quickly categorize different objects. When we consciously think of a tree, we are indeed conscious of a particular tree, of the fir or the oak or the elm that grew beside our house, and let it stand for the concept, just as we can let a concept word stand for it as well. In fact, one of the great functions of language is to let the word stand for a concept, which is exactly what we do in writing or speaking about conceptual material. It is difficult to look at these images without knowing intuitively what they are, and this is because language also helps us to perceive the world and quickly categorize things, and this is very helpful for survival, because it allows you to make decisions quickly during stressful situations. However, the structure of consciousness is actually more complicated than this. Although we have described a metaphor as being composed of a metaphrand and a metaphyer, there are actually other associations attached to the metaphor, which Jaynes calls paraphiers. A paraphier is something associated with the metaphyer, which projects back into the metaphrand. For example, when we use the metaphor that love is like a rose, love is the metaphrand and the rose is the metaphyer. There are many paraphiers or associations with the rose which project back into the concept of love. For example, roses are red, and the color red is a paraphier of the rose. This paraphier projects back into the metaphrand and creates an association between the color red and the concept of love. In actuality, the color red has nothing to do with the concept of love, except for the fact that the metaphor of love as being similar to a rose creates an association between love and the color red. Not every metaphor has such paraphiers, but many of them do. These paraphiers often sit at the back of our minds when we perceive the world, and they are also a feature of consciousness. Paraphiers may also depend on our past experiences and on our memories. If I ask you to think about a bird, a particular image of a bird may appear in your head. And this image is usually an archetypal image of a bird, which is meant to stand for the concept of a bird. What you pictured likely looks something like this, and it is less likely that you imagined an ostrich or a penguin. The paraphiers that you associate with the word bird will help determine what you picture. Another example that might make this clearer is to consider being conscious of your elbow again. Being conscious of your elbow means that the metaphyer is your physical elbow. The metaphrand is the concept or word elbow that you have in your head. But what are the paraphiers? You may know what your elbow feels like when you touch it. You may also know where your elbow is relative to the rest of your body. These associations, or paraphiers, influence the structure of consciousness, and the degree of your consciousness of your elbow. Although language is important for this structure, Jaynes specifically notes that consciousness is not all language, but it is generated by it and accessed by it. In the last video, we described consciousness as an analog. An analog is something which is meant to represent something which exists in the physical world, and consciousness does help us understand the world through language. However, Jaynes notes that an analog can be both a metaphrand and a metaphyer. A cardinal property of an analog is that the way it is generated is not the way it is used, obviously. The map maker and map user are doing two different things. For the map maker, the metaphrand is the blank piece of paper on which he operates with the metaphyer of the land he knows and has surveyed. But for the map user, it is just the other way around. The land is unknown. It is the land that is the metaphrand, while the metaphyer is the map which he is using, by which he understands the land. This essentially means that consciousness helps us to understand the world, but it also, in some sense, helps to generate the world itself, which allows us to focus on the relevant parts of the world. Consciousness becomes the metaphyer, full of our past experience, constantly and selectively operating on such unknowns as future actions, decisions, and partly remembered pasts, on what we are and yet may be. And it is by this generated structure of consciousness that we then understand the world. This structure of consciousness has several important features. Spatialization is something we discussed briefly in part 1, and it involves the creation of metaphorical mind spaces or the spatialization of time. When we introspect, a metaphor of seeing into something, it is upon this metaphorical mind space which we are constantly renewing and enlarging, with each new thing or relation consciousized. Mind spaces are a part of what it is to be conscious, and what it is to assume consciousness in others. Excerption is another important feature of consciousness. In consciousness, we are never seeing anything in its entirety. This is because such seeing is an analog of actual behavior, and in actual behavior, we can only see or pay attention to a part of a thing at one moment. This is because such seeing is an analog of actual behavior, and in actual behavior, we can only see or pay attention to a part of a thing at any one moment. And so in consciousness, we excerpt from the collection of possible attentions to a thing which comprises our knowledge of it. And this is all that it is possible to do, since consciousness is a metaphor of our actual behavior. If I ask you to imagine New York City, you will probably think about certain landmarks, and these landmarks are excerpts, which are meant to represent the city overall. And so when we are conscious of something, we tend to use excerpts to help simplify whatever it is that we are conscious of. These excerptions are often influenced by our past experience, as well as on our present mood. As Jaynes notes, your excerptions of someone you know well are heavily associated with your affect toward him. If you like him, the excerpts will be the pleasant things, if not, the unpleasant. The causation may be in either direction. Consciousness allows for the existence of an analog I. Every conscious person has a metaphorical concept of themselves, which Jaynes calls the analog I. A most important feature of this metaphor world is the metaphor we have of ourselves, the analog I, which can move about vicariously in our imagination, doing things that we are not actually doing. There are, of course, many uses for such an analog I. We imagine ourselves doing this or that, and thus make decisions on the basis of imagined outcomes. That would be impossible if we did not have an imagined self behaving in an imagined world. It is difficult to realize that the concept of the self is actually just a metaphorical analog. But if we imagine ourselves doing some activity, for example swimming, we are really imagining our analog I performing the action. This analog I also includes the metaphor me, which includes everything we believe about ourselves. The relationship between the I and the me is known as the ego in some psychological systems. As Carl Jung notes, the ego is an object in consciousness. Narratization refers to the process our minds use to create narratives about the world. As you go about your day, this ongoing process of narratization is always acting to guide our actions. New situations are selectively perceived as part of this ongoing story, perceptions that do not fit into it being unnoticed or at least unremembered. More important, situations are chosen which are congruent to this ongoing story, until the picture I have of myself in my life story determines how I am to act and choose in novel situations as they arise. We also narratize after events have occurred in order to justify them after the fact, such as when a thief narratizes his or her actions as a result of poverty. It is important to note that our analog I is the main character of this narratization. Consciousness is constantly fitting things into a story, putting a before and an after around any event. This feature is an analog of our physical selves moving about through a physical world, with its spatial successiveness, which becomes the successiveness of time in mind space. And this results in the conscious conception of time, which is a spatialized time, in which we locate events and indeed our lives. The basic connotative definition of consciousness is thus an analog I narratizing in a functional mind space. Jaynes summarizes this basic conception of consciousness in the following way. Consciousness is an operation rather than a thing, a repository or a function. It operates by way of analogy, by way of constructing an analog space with an analog I that can observe that space and move metaphorically in it. It operates on any reactivity, excerpts relevant aspects, narratizes and conciliates them together in a metaphorical space where such meanings can be manipulated like things in space. Conscious mind is a spatial analog of the world, and mental acts are analogs of bodily acts. If all of this was confusing, there are a few simple ways to understand the nature of consciousness. Imagine yourself doing something, such as going for a walk in a park. You create a narratization of yourself going for a walk. You might imagine what it feels like, or how the weather is. Now imagine that you were actually going for a walk. Being conscious of yourself going for a walk is to create the same narratization at the same time that you were walking. The narratization and the action, i.e. going for a walk, occur at the same time, and this is what it means to be conscious of yourself. If you are playing the piano and become conscious of playing the piano, what is happening is that you are narratizing your analog I in the situation of playing the piano, and this is partly why consciousness may actually cause you to make a mistake. The implications of this conception of consciousness are quite profound. It means that, in some sense, consciousness is not actually real. It is actually a persistent hallucination which overlays our perception of the world. It also means that consciousness must have developed after we developed language, which means that it is unlikely that animals possess conscious awareness, and all of its features, including a metaphorical ego. This also means that consciousness must be related to the speech areas of the brain. But does this mean that mankind became conscious soon after the development of language? Possibly, but Jaynes believes that a different mentality existed before consciousness, and this mentality was that of the bicameral mind, and he believed that the bicameral mind must have preceded consciousness. There is still a lot more to cover regarding this theory, so stay tuned for additional videos in the future.